where civilization fades and terror thrives in complete isolation. In this episode, we will journey into the darkest corners of America's forgotten landscapes, where individuals experienced encounters that defy explanation and shattered their sense of safety forever. Each account you are about to hear has been meticulously reconstructed from first-hand testimonies, witness statements, and documented reports of those who survived to share their harrowing experiences. These are not fictional tales designed to entertain. These are real events that happened to real people, in places where help was miles away, and escape seemed impossible. To respect privacy and protection of those involved, certain names and identifying details have been carefully altered, but the core of each terrifying experience remains completely intact. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Fear Files for daily true horror content that will keep you awake long after the lights go out. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us begin our descent into the most isolated and disturbing true horror stories ever documented. My name is Logan, and what I am about to tell you happened 3 years ago in the remote wilderness of northwestern Montana. I have spent most of my adult life hiking through the back country, exploring places where most people would never venture. I have always been drawn to solitude, to the kind of silence you can only find miles away from civilization. But after what I discovered in those woods, I have learned that some places are isolated for a reason, and some silences hide secrets that were never meant to be uncovered. It was late September, and I had planned a week-long solo hiking trip through the Cabinet Mountains wilderness. The area is rugged, unforgiving, and beautiful in a way that feels almost hostile. Most trails see maybe a handful of hikers each season, and once you get beyond the established paths, you are completely alone. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed my gear, drove to the nearest trailhead, and set out before dawn on a Monday morning. The forecast called for clear skies and cool temperatures, perfect conditions for covering serious distance. For the first 2 days, everything went exactly as planned. I followed a well-worn trail that climbed steadily through dense pine forests and across rocky ridgeal lines. The views were spectacular, the kind that make you feel small in the best possible way. By the third day, I had reached a remote valley that sat cradled between two mountain peaks. According to my map, there were no trails beyond this point, just endless wilderness stretching north for miles. I decided to explore off-trail, following a creek bed that seemed to lead deeper into the valley. The forest grew thicker as I descended, the canopy overhead blocking out most of the sunlight. The air was cooler here, almost damp, and the only sounds were the rush of water over stones and the occasional snap of a branch beneath my boots. I had been walking for maybe 2 hours when I noticed something unusual ahead. Through the trees, I could make out the straight lines of a structure, something man-made in a place where nothing should exist. As I got closer, I realized it was a homestead, or what remained of one. The main building was a 2-story farmhouse, its wooden siding weathered to a dull gray and covered in creeping moss. The windows were dark and empty, some broken, others intact, but coated in years of grime. To the left of the house stood a smaller outbuilding, maybe a barn or workshop, its roof partially collapsed. A rusted water pump sat in what must have once been a front yard, now completely overgrown with weeds and saplings. I stopped at the edge of the clearing and studied the place. There was something deeply unsettling about it, though I could not immediately identify why. It was not just the isolation or the decay. It was the silence. Even the creek seemed quieter here, as if the water itself was reluctant to make noise. I checked my GPS and confirmed what I already suspected. This location was not marked on any map. There were no trails leading here, no roads, no indication that anyone had ever lived in this valley. Curiosity got the better of me. I approached the house slowly, my boots crunching on dead leaves and brittle grass. The front door hung open, its hinges rusted and broken. I pulled out my flashlight and stepped inside. The smell hit me immediately. A thick, musty odor of rot and mildew mixed with something else, something metallic and faintly sweet. The interior was dark, despite the broken windows, and dust hung in the air like fog. The main room appeared to have been a living area. A collapsed sofa sat against one wall, its fabric shredded and stained. A wooden table lay overturned in the center of the room, and broken dishes were scattered across the floor. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust and dirt, undisturbed for what looked like decades. I moved deeper into the house, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. That is when I noticed the marks on the walls. Deep gouges ran along the wooden planks, long scratches that looked almost deliberate, as if someone had dragged their fingernails down the surface again and again. I ran my hand over one of the grooves. It was too deep to have been made by an animal, and the pattern was too consistent to be random damage. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, each step groaning under my weight. There were 3 rooms up here, all small and cramped. The first two were empty except for debris and broken furniture, but the third room stopped me cold. The door was reinforced with metal brackets, and a heavy padlock hung from the latch, broken and dangling uselessly. I pushed the door open and immediately wished I had not. The room was maybe 10 feet by 10 feet with a single small window that had been boarded shut from the outside, but it was what I saw on the floor that made my blood run cold. Bolted into the wooden planks, or 4 heavy iron rings, the kind used to secure chains or restraints. The wood around them was stained dark, almost black in a way that looked horribly like dried blood. The walls were covered in more scratch marks, these ones frantic and chaotic, concentrated around the door and window. I stepped closer and noticed something else. Carved into the wall beside the window were words, crude letters etched deep into the wood. They read, "Help me, basement." The letters were uneven and shaky, as if scratched in desperation with something sharp. My hands were trembling as I backed out of the room. Every instinct told me to leave, to get out of this house, and never look back. But the word basement echoed in my mind. I had not seen a basement entrance on the main floor, but I had not been looking for one either. I forced myself to go back downstairs and search more carefully. I found the door in the kitchen hidden behind a section of collapsed shelving. It was heavy wood reinforced like the upstairs bedroom, and it opened to reveal a narrow staircase descending into complete darkness. The smell that rose from below was overwhelming, so thick I had to cover my mouth and nose with my shirt. I almost turned back, but something compelled me forward. I needed to know what was down there. The basement was low ceiling and damp, the walls made of rough stone. My flashlight beam swept across the space, revealing a scene that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Along one wall were shelves stacked with glass jars, dozens of them, their contents impossible to identify in the dim light. In the center of the room sat a large wooden table, its surface covered in dark stains that had soaked deep into the grain. Beside the table were metal tools, rusted and corroded, but still recognizable. Saws, knives, pliers, things that had no business being in a basement. But what truly terrified me were the notebooks. Stacked in neat piles on a smaller side table were leather-bound journals, maybe 20 or 30 of them. I picked one up with shaking hands and opened it. The pages were filled with handwritten entries, dates going back decades. The writing was meticulous, detailed descriptions of experiments, observations, measurements. The language was clinical, detached, describing acts of unimaginable cruelty, as if they were scientific procedures. I read entry after entry, my horror growing with each page. The writer described subjects, people they had brought to this place. The entries detailed how long each person survived, how they reacted to various forms of torture, what sounds they made, how their bodies responded to systematic brutality. Some entries included sketches, anatomical drawings that made my stomach turn. The most recent entry was dated 15 years ago. It simply read, "Final subject expired. Location compromised. Relocating operation." The handwriting was the same throughout all the journals, spanning what looked like 40 or 50 years. Whoever had done this had been operating in this remote valley for half a century, completely undetected. I dropped the journal and stumbled backward, my mind reeling. I had to get out of this basement, out of this house, and report what I'd found. I turned toward the stairs and froze. In the darkness beyond my flashlight beam, I heard something, a faint creaking sound like footsteps on old floorboards above me. I stood perfectly still, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor overhead. Someone or something was in the house with me. I had not heard anyone enter. I had not heard a door open or close, but the footsteps were real, and they were moving toward the kitchen, toward the basement door. I switched off my flashlight and pressed myself against the stone wall, trying to control my breathing. The footsteps stopped directly above me. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then I heard the basement door crack open. Light footsteps began descending the stairs, one slow step at a time. I could not see anything in the absolute darkness, but I could hear them getting closer. My mind raced. There was no other way out of this basement. I was trapped. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. I held my breath, pressing myself harder against the wall, praying that whoever it was could not see me in the dark. Then I heard breathing soft and measured somewhere close to me in the blackness. A voice spoke low and calm. "You should not have come here." I did not wait to hear more. I switched on my flashlight and ran. The beam swept across the basement, briefly illuminating a figure standing near the stairs, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing. I did not look long enough to see their face. I shoved past them, nearly falling as I scrambled up the stairs. I burst through the kitchen and out the front door, running as fast as I could across the overgrown yard and back into the forest. I did not stop running until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out. Only then did I risk a glance behind me. The forest was empty. No one had followed me, or at least no one I could see. I pulled out my GPS and marked the location of the homestead, then started the long hike back to the trailhead. It took me 6 hours to reach my truck. I drove straight to the nearest town and went directly to the sheriff's office. I told them everything I had found, showed them the GPS coordinates, described the journals and the basement in detail. The deputy who took my statement was skeptical at first, but something in my face must have convinced him I was serious. 2 days later, I got a call from a state investigator. They had sent a team to the coordinates I provided. They found the valley. They found the creek. But they found no homestead, no building, no foundation, no evidence that any structure had ever existed in that location. They searched the entire area for 2 days and found nothing. I have returned to those woods twice since then, following my own GPS markers to the exact spot where I know that house stood. There is nothing there now, just trees and undergrowth and the sound of the creek flowing over stones. But I know what I saw. I know what I read in those journals. And I know that somewhere whoever wrote those entries is still out there, continuing their work in another forgotten corner of the wilderness. I still hike, but I stay on established trails now, and I have learned that some places in the middle of nowhere are isolated for a reason. Some secrets are buried so deep that finding them changes you forever. I found one of those secrets, and even though no one believes me, I will carry the weight of it for the rest of my life. My name is Sophie, and I grew up in the back country of West Virginia, where the mountains are old and the valleys run deep. People who are not from here do not understand what it means to live in a place where the forest has been standing since before this country existed, where there are hollows so remote that sunlight only touches them for a few hours each day. I learned early on that the woods demand respect, that there are things moving through those trees that have no names and no explanation. What happened to me 5 years ago proved that everything the old-timers whispered about was true. It was early October, and I had decided to spend the afternoon exploring a dried creek bed that ran through the back end of my family's property. We owned about 200 acres of heavily forested land, most of it untouched and wild. The creek bed was one of my favorite spots during the dry season. It carved a winding path through the hills, bordered on both sides by steep banks and dense undergrowth. When the water was low or gone completely, you could walk along the smooth stone and feel like you had stepped into another world somewhere ancient and untouched. I set out around 2 in the afternoon with my dog, a German Shepherd mix named Rusty, who had been my constant companion for 6 years. Rusty knew these woods as well as I did, maybe better. He had never shown fear of anything out here, not even when we encountered black bears or coyotes. He was fearless and loyal, and I trusted his instincts completely. The weather was perfect, cool and crisp, with a bright autumn sun filtering through the canopy. Leaves crunched beneath my boots as I made my way down the slope toward the creek bed. Rusty ran ahead, his tail wagging as he investigated every interesting scent. By the time I reached the creek, he was already 50 yards downstream, nose to the ground. I jumped down onto the rocky bed and started walking, enjoying the solitude and the quiet. The creek had been dry for weeks, leaving behind only smooth stones and patches of damp sand. Overhead, the trees formed a thick canopy that blocked out most of the sky, creating a tunnel of gold and orange foliage. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost sacred. I had been walking for maybe 20 minutes when Rusty stopped suddenly. He stood completely still about 30 feet ahead of me, his body rigid, and his ears pinned back. I'd never seen him freeze like that before. I called his name, but he did not respond. His eyes were locked on something in the trees to our left up on the bank, above the creek bed. I followed his gaze, but saw nothing except dense undergrowth and the dark trunks of oak and hickory trees. The forest looked the same as it always did, shadows and leaves and tangled branches. But something had spooked Rusty badly. His hackles were raised, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. Then I heard it. A sound like something heavy moving through the underbrush, slow and deliberate. Branches snapped and leaves rustled, but I could not see what was causing it. The sound was moving parallel to us, staying up on the bank, but keeping pace as we stood there. Rusty began backing up slowly, his growl growing louder. I'd never seen him retreat for anything before. My heart started pounding as I realized that whatever was up there, it was big, and it was tracking us. I reached down and grabbed Rusty's collar, whispering for him to stay close. The movement in the trees stopped. For a long moment, everything was silent except for the sound of my own breathing. Then I saw it. About 40 feet away, something emerged from behind a thick stand of laurel bushes. At first, I thought it was a bear. It was low to the ground, moving on all fours with a dark shape that seemed about the right size. But as it stepped into a patch of filtered sunlight, I realized it was not a bear at all. The body was wrong. It was too long, too narrow, with limbs that bent at angles that did not match any animal I had ever seen. The skin or fur was a mottled gray-brown, matted and dirty. But what made my blood run cold was the way it moved. It did not lumber or shuffle like a bear. It crawled with a fluid, almost serpentine motion, its shoulders rolling as it pulled itself forward. It stopped at the edge of the bank and turned its head toward me. I still could not see its face clearly through the shadows, but I could see enough. The head was too large, shaped wrong, with a jaw that seemed to protrude further than it should. And then it stood up. I will never forget that moment as long as I live. The creature rose from its crawling position onto two legs in one smooth, unnatural motion. When it reached its full height, it towered at least 7 or 8 feet tall. Its arms hung down past its knees, long and thin with joints that seemed to bend in too many places. It stood there on the bank above us, completely motionless, just watching. Rusty erupted into frantic barking, the kind of terrified, aggressive sound I had never heard from him before. He pulled against my grip on his collar, desperate to run. Every instinct I had screamed at me to do the same. But I was frozen, unable to tear my eyes away from the thing standing above us. Then it moved. It took one step down the bank toward the creek bed, then another. Each movement was deliberate and measured, as if it was testing our reaction. I could hear its breathing now, a wet, rasping sound that echoed off the rocks. That sound broke my paralysis. I turned and ran, pulling Rusty with me. We tore downstream along the creek bed, rocks sliding beneath my feet, as I struggled to keep my balance. Behind us, I heard the creature drop down into the creek bed with a heavy thud. Then I heard it running. The sound of its footfalls was wrong, irregular, and too fast for something of its size. I risked a glance over my shoulder and wished I had not. The thing was following us, moving with a loping gait that covered ground impossibly quickly. It was not running on 2 legs or 4, but something in between, using its long arms to propel itself forward in a nightmarish gallop. I knew I could not outrun it. The creek bed wound through the hills for miles, and I was already gasping for breath. I had to get out of the creek and into the denser forest where maybe I could lose it. I spotted a section where the bank was lower and scrambled up, hauling Rusty behind me. We plunged into the thick undergrowth, branches whipping at my face and arms. The creature followed. I could hear it crashing through the brush behind us, that horrible rasping breathing getting closer. Rusty was running flat out beside me, his eyes wide with terror. We burst through a stand of mountain laurel and nearly fell down a steep slope on the other side. I grabbed a tree trunk to steady myself and looked back. The creature had stopped at the edge of the laurel thicket. It stood there, barely visible through the dense branches, its massive form swaying slightly. And then it did something that made my skin crawl. It mimicked me. It reached out with one long arm and grabbed a tree trunk exactly as I had done, matching my posture and stance. Then it tilted its head to the side, studying me. I did not wait to see what it would do next. I turned and continued running, half sliding down the slope and into another section of forest. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were made of lead. But pure terror kept me moving. I had no idea where I was anymore. I had lost all sense of direction in my panicked flight. For the next hour, I ran and walked and stumbled through those woods, always with the feeling that the creature was just behind me and just out of sight. Several times I heard movement in the trees, the snap of a branch, or the rustle of leaves, but I never saw it again. Rusty stayed pressed against my side, whimpering occasionally, but never leaving me. Finally, I recognized a rocky outcropping that I knew was only half a mile from the edge of our property. I pushed through my exhaustion and made it to the tree that bordered our back pasture. I had never been so grateful to see open space in my life. Rusty and I ran across that field and did not stop until we reached the house. My parents were in the kitchen when I burst through the door, covered in scratches and dirt, gasping for breath. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out jumbled and incoherent. My father grabbed his rifle and went out to check the woods, but he found nothing. No tracks, no signs of anything unusual. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that I had seen a bear, that fear. Adrenaline had distorted my perception and made me imagine things that were not real. But I knew the truth. I knew what I had seen, and I knew that it had been intelligent enough to track me, to mimic me, to study me. I did some research and found stories from other people in Appalachia who had seen similar things. They called them by different names: crawlers, not deer, pale walkers, but the descriptions were always similar: tall, thin creatures that moved wrong and did not belong to any known species. Most people who saw them were laughed at or dismissed as crazy. I learned to keep my story to myself. I still live on my family's property, but I do not go into those woods alone anymore. Sometimes at night, when I let Rusty out before bed, he will stand in the yard and stare at the tree, and his body tense and his ears alert. I know he is remembering that day just as I am. We both know that something lives in those hills, something that watches and waits in the shadows of the old mountains. The old-timers say that these mountains are older than humanity, that they have seen things come and go that we cannot comprehend. They say that some things have always been here long before we arrived, and they will be here long after we are gone. I will leave them now. I know that what I encountered in that creek bed was not an animal, not in any conventional sense. It was something else, something that exists in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. I have not been back to that creek bed since that day. Sometimes I dream about it, about standing on those smooth stones and hearing that rasping breath echoing off the rocks. In the dreams, I turn around and the creature is standing right behind me, tall and impossible, reaching out with those long arms. I always wake up before it touches me, my heart racing and my sheets soaked with sweat. Rusty passed away 2 years ago, old age finally catching up with him. But even in his final years, he would never go near that section of the property. He knew what was out there, just as I do. And whatever it was, it is still there, moving through those ancient hills, crawling through dried creek beds and watching from the shadows. I just hope I never see it again. My name is Mason, and I have been driving long-haul routes across the Southwest for nearly 15 years. I have seen every kind of road condition, every type of weather, and met strange people than I can count. When you spend that much time alone on empty highways in the middle of the night, you learn to trust your instincts, and you learn that some things cannot be explained by logic or reason. What happened to me on a desolate stretch of New Mexico highway 3 years ago still makes no sense, and I have stopped trying to make it make sense. It was late August, and I was hauling freight from Albuquerque to El Paso on Interstate 25. The route is mostly straightforward, but I had decided to take a detour along some back roads to avoid construction delays that would have cost me several hours. My GPS showed an alternate route that would save time, cutting through some truly remote desert country south of Socorro. I had driven variations of this route before, so I was not concerned about getting lost. I left Albuquerque around 11 at night, planning to reach El Paso by dawn. The first hour was uneventful, just dark highway, and the occasional pair of headlights passing in the opposite direction. Once I turned onto the back roads, though, the traffic disappeared completely. It was just me, my truck, and endless stretches of empty asphalt cutting through the high desert. The landscape out there is harsh and unforgiving even in daylight. At night, it becomes something else entirely. The darkness is absolute, broken only by my headlights and the occasional distant glow of a ranch house or radio tower. The road wound through low hills and dry arroyos, mile after mile of nothing but sagebrush and rock formations that looked like ancient sentinels in the darkness. It was around 2 in the morning when I saw her. At first, she was just a figure on the side of the road, illuminated briefly by my headlights as I came around a curve. My first instinct was to keep driving. You do not stop for people on desolate roads in the middle of the night, not if you have any sense of self-preservation. But something made me slow down and look in my side mirror. She was young, maybe early 22nds, wearing jeans and a light jacket. Her arm was extended with her thumb out in the classic hitchhiker pose. What struck me immediately was how clean she looked, how normal. There was no broken-down car nearby, no visible reason for her to be standing alone on this empty road at 2 in the morning, miles from the nearest town. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. I told myself I would just ask if she needed help. Maybe call someone for her. I rolled down my passenger window as she approached the truck. Up close, she looked even younger, with long dark hair, pulled back in a ponytail, and dark eyes that reflected my headlights oddly. Need a ride? I asked, already regretting stopping. She nodded and smiled, a strange distant smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Yes, please. I need to get to Carrizo. Carrizo was about 40 miles north of where we were, which meant she was heading in the opposite direction from me. I was about to tell her I could not help when she added, "But I can show you a shortcut first. There is a place you need to see." That should have been my signal to drive away. Nothing about that statement made sense, but there was something compelling about her voice, something that made the words feel important, urgent even. Before I fully realized what I was doing, I reached over and unlocked the passenger door. She climbed into the cab with an easy grace, settling into the seat without a sound. She smelled faintly of dust and something else, something I could not quite identify. Sage maybe, or old paper. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Not many people stop anymore." I pulled back onto the road, glancing over at her periodically as I drove. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead through the windshield. The silence stretched between us, not quite comfortable, but not hostile either. "So what are you doing out here?" I finally asked, trying to fill the quiet. "Going home," she replied simply. "From where?" "Away." Her answers were vague, almost cryptic, but delivered in such a matter-of-fact tone that I found myself not pressing further. After about 10 minutes, she suddenly spoke again. "Turn left at the next junction." I looked at my GPS. There was no junction marked on the map ahead. "There is no turn coming up," I said. "There is," she insisted. "You will see it." Sure enough, less than a minute later, my headlights illuminated a narrow dirt road branching off to the left. It was not marked on my GPS, and there was no sign indicating where it led. Just a gap in the brush and a pair of faint tire tracks disappearing into the darkness. "Turn here," she said. Every rational part of my brain screamed not to turn onto an unmarked dirt road in the middle of nowhere with a stranger in my truck. But I turned. I cannot explain why. It felt necessary, inevitable, like I was following a script I had not written. The dirt road was rough and narrow, barely wide enough for my truck. Branches scraped against the sides as we pushed deeper into the desert. The woman sat silent beside me, still staring straight ahead. After what felt like miles, but was probably only half that distance, the road opened into a small clearing. "Stop here," she said. I pulled to a stop and looked around. The clearing was maybe 50 feet across, ringed by low hills and scattered juniper trees. In the center of the clearing was a weathered wooden cross, the kind you sometimes see marking roadside memorials. But there was no road here, no reason for a memorial to exist in this isolated spot. "Do you see it?" she asked. "The cross?" "Yes." "Read what it says." I hesitated, then opened my door and climbed down from the cab. The air outside was cold and still, with no wind, no sound of insects or animals, just absolute silence. I walked over to the cross, pulling out my phone to use as a flashlight. The wood was old and splintered, but someone had carved words into the horizontal beam. I had to lean close to make them out in the dim light from my phone. The inscription read, "Elena Vasquez, beloved daughter, August 15th, 2007. May she find her way home." A chill ran down my spine. I turned back toward the truck, intending to ask the woman about the memorial, but when I looked at the passenger seat, it was empty. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding. She could not have gotten out without me hearing. The door had not opened. I had not heard footsteps, but the cab was completely empty, as if she had never been there at all. I walked around the entire truck, checking behind it, scanning the clearing with my phone light. Nothing, no trace of her anywhere. The clearing was silent and empty except for me and that withered cross. My hands shaking, I climbed back into the cab and pulled out my phone. Despite being in the middle of nowhere, I somehow had signal. I searched for Elena Vasquez and the date on the memorial. The results loaded slowly, but what I found made my blood run cold. Elena Vasquez had been a 22-year-old college student from Socorro. In August of 2007, she had been driving alone at night when her car broke down on a remote highway. According to the news articles, she had started walking trying to find help. She was found 3 days later dead from exposure, approximately 2 miles from where I was now sitting. The exact location coordinates were listed in one of the articles. I checked them against my GPS. I was sitting at those exact coordinates. The articles included a photograph of Elena, the young woman smiling at. The camera had long dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and dark eyes. It was her. The woman I had picked up. The woman who had been sitting in my passenger seat just minutes ago had been dead for 16 years. I do not remember much about the drive back to the main highway. I know I drove too fast, nearly losing control on the rough dirt road multiple times. I know that I kept checking the passenger seat, half expecting to see her sitting there again. And I know that when I finally reached the paved road, I pulled over and sat shaking for nearly an hour before I could continue driving. I never made that delivery to El Paso. I turned around and drove straight back to Albuquerque, called my dispatcher, and told him I was sick. I spent the next week trying to convince myself that I had fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed the entire encounter. But I could not explain the dirt road, which was real, and which I found again later on satellite imagery. I could not explain how I knew the exact location of Elena Vasquez's memorial, a location that was not marked on any map. I have talked to other long-haul drivers since then, asking carefully if they had ever experienced anything strange on those empty desert roads. More than a few have shared similar stories. Encounters with hitchhikers who vanished, voices on the CB radio that should not be there, figures seen in the rear-view mirror that disappear when you look directly at them. There is something about those lonely stretches of highway, those places where the darkness is complete and civilization feels like a distant memory. The barrier between what is and what was seems thinner out there. Or maybe the dead just get tired of waiting to be found, tired of being forgotten in the empty places where they died. I still drive long-haul routes, but I avoid that particular stretch of New Mexico highway now. And I do not stop for hitchhikers anymore, no matter how desperate they look or how normal they seem, because I learned that night that sometimes the people standing on the side of the road are not looking for a ride to somewhere new. Sometimes they are just trying to find their way back to a moment they never got to leave, trying to complete a journey that ended too soon in the darkness and the dust. I hope Elena Vasquez found her way home that night. I hope that by bringing me to her memorial, she somehow found peace. But I will never know for certain, and that uncertainty haunts me every time I drive through empty country in the dead of night, wondering if the next figure I see on the side of the road is flesh and blood or something else, something still searching. My name is Ava, and I grew up spending summers at my family's cabin in northern Maine, deep in the woods about 20 meters from the nearest town. The cabin has been in our family for 3 generations, a rustic 2-bedroom structure built by my grandfather in the late 1950s. It sits on the edge of a small lake surrounded by dense pine forest that stretches for miles in every direction. As a child, I loved that place. It represented freedom and adventure, endless days of swimming and hiking and sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the water. But after what happened during my stay there 4 years ago, I cannot look at that cabin the same way. I cannot look at those woods the same way either. It was early November, and I decided to spend a long weekend at the cabin alone. I was 28 at the time, going through a difficult breakup, and I needed space to think and process everything. My parents were concerned about me going alone so late in the season, but I insisted. I had been to the cabin dozens of times, and I felt comfortable there. Besides, I welcomed the solitude and the chance to disconnect from the world for a few days. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. The drive up had been peaceful, the fall colors fading into the muted browns and grays of late autumn. The lake was calm and dark, reflecting the overcast sky. I unloaded my supplies, started a fire in the wood stove, and settled in for what I hoped would be a quiet, restorative weekend. The first night passed without incident. I made dinner, read a book by lamplight, and went to bed early. The cabin has no electricity or running water, so nights there are truly dark and quiet in a way that city dwellers can scarcely imagine. I've always found that darkness comforting, the kind of deep silence that allows you to hear your own thoughts clearly. Saturday morning, I woke to find the weather had turned cold and gray. A light drizzle was falling, creating a soft pattering sound on the cabin roof. I spent the morning reading and journaling, occasionally stoking the fire to keep the chill at bay. By afternoon, the rain had stopped, and I decided to take a walk along the lake shore to stretch my legs. The air was crisp and smelled of wet pine needles and decaying leaves. I walked for about an hour, following the familiar path that circled the lake. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. But as I made my way back toward the cabin, I noticed something that made me pause. At the edge of the tree, maybe 50 yards from the cabin, there appeared to be a figure standing motionless among the pines. I stopped and squinted, trying to make out details in the fading afternoon light. The figure was tall and dark, roughly human in shape, but oddly still. I assumed it was a tree or a stump that I was misperceiving from a distance, the kind of visual trick that happens when shadows and branches align just right. I continued walking, but I kept glancing over at the spot. The figure did not move. When I reached the cabin, I looked back toward the tree. The figure was still there. Or at least something was still there. I grabbed the binoculars we kept on the porch and focused on the spot. What I saw made my skin prickle with unease. It was definitely not a tree. It was a shape, black and vaguely human, standing perfectly upright among the pines. I could not make out any features or details, just a dark silhouette that seemed too tall and too still to be a person. I watched for several minutes, waiting for movement, but the figure remained motionless. Eventually, I convinced myself it had to be a trick of the light or shadow, something natural that I was misinterpreting. I went inside and tried to focus on making dinner, but I found myself constantly looking out the window toward the train. The figure was still there as darkness fell. That night, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked, something I had never bothered to do at the cabin before. I tried to read, but I could not concentrate. Every small sound, every creak of the cabin settling made me jump. Around 10, I finally forced myself to go to bed, telling myself I was being ridiculous and paranoid. I woke sometime after midnight. The cabin was pitch black, and utterly silent. I lay in bed trying to identify what had woken me when I heard it. A soft scraping sound like something being dragged across wood. It was coming from outside somewhere near the front of the cabin. My heart began pounding as I sat up slowly. The sound continued slow and deliberate. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. It was moving along the front wall of the cabin, getting closer to my bedroom window. I reached for the flashlight I kept beside the bed, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The scraping stopped directly outside my window. For a long moment, there was complete silence. Then I heard breathing, slow and steady, just on the other side of the glass. Something was standing right outside my window, close enough that I could hear it breathe. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I was frozen with terror. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I heard footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving away from the window and around the side of the cabin. I sat in bed, clutching the flashlight, too terrified to move or make a sound. I listened to the footsteps circle the entire cabin, pausing at each window before continuing. Whatever was out, there was checking every window, every entrance, as if looking for a way inside. After completing his circuit of the cabin, the footsteps stopped at the front door. I heard the door handle rattle, a slow testing motion. The door held, lock doing its job, more silence. Then the footsteps moved away back toward the tree. I waited in the darkness, hardly breathing, until I could no longer hear anything outside. I did not sleep the rest of that night. I sat in bed with the flashlight and my phone, which had no signal, but at least provided some comfort. As soon as the first light of dawn began filtering through the windows, I looked outside. The front yard was empty. The tree looked ordinary and unthreatening in the pale morning light. But when I worked up the courage to go outside, I found something that confirmed I had not imagined the events of the night before. Around the cabin, beneath each window, were marks in the soft ground. They were not animal tracks or footprints. They were impressions, like something had been pressed into the earth. But the shapes made no sense. They were too large and oddly shaped, not matching any print I had ever seen. And there was something else. On the outside of each window were smudges, as if something had pressed against the glass. But these were not ordinary handprints. The patterns were wrong, the proportions off. The marks had too many finger-like impressions, and they were positioned too high on the windows, at least 7 feet up. I packed my things in under an hour and left. I did not bother to clean up or properly close down the cabin. I just loaded my car and drove away as fast as I could. When I reached an area with cell service, I called my father and told him what had happened. He drove up to the cabin that same day with my uncle. They found the marks I had described both in the ground and on the windows. They also found something I had not noticed in my rush to leave. At the edge of the tree, where I had seen the figure standing, the pine needles and undergrowth had been compressed, as if something heavy had been standing there for an extended period. My father and uncle stayed at the cabin that night, both armed and alert. They reported hearing nothing unusual, seeing nothing out of the ordinary. The next morning, the marks on the windows were gone as if they had been wiped away. The impressions in the ground were less distinct, faded as if by rain, though no rain had fallen. We researched reports from other people in the area, looking for similar experiences. What we found was unsettling. There were stories going back decades, whispered accounts from hunters and hikers who had encountered tall, dark figures in the northern Maine woods. Most people dismissed these as misidentifications of bears or shadows. The usual explanations, but some of the descriptions matched what I had seen, particularly the height and the unnatural stillness. One elderly man we spoke to, a lifelong resident of the area, told us about the Watchers. He said they were something that had always been in those woods, something that preceded human settlement. According to local Native American traditions, there were certain areas of the forest that were forbidden places where the boundary between worlds was thin and where things that did not belong in our reality could pass through. He suggested that our cabin might be located near one of these areas. I have not been back to the cabin since that weekend. My parents go occasionally, always in pairs, always during daylight hours. They have never seen anything unusual, but I know what I experienced. I know something was watching me from those pines, something that moved around that cabin, testing every window and every door. Something that left marks that defied explanation. Sometimes I wonder if it is still there, standing among those trees, waiting and watching, and I wonder if it watches my parents when they visit, if it remembers me and waits for me to return. That thought keeps me awake some nights. The image of that tall, dark figure standing motionless at the edge of the forest, patient and eternal, as if time means nothing to it. The cabin remains in our family, but I will never spend another night there alone. Some places in the wilderness hold more than just trees and animals. Some places are home to things we cannot explain, things that watch from the shadows and wait for moments when we are isolated and vulnerable. I found one of those places, and the memory of those marks on the windows, those impossible impressions in the ground, will stay with me forever. My name is Hunter, and I have always been fascinated by abandoned places. There is something compelling about exploring structures that have been left behind, frozen in time, holding on to the echoes of whatever happened within their walls. I've explored dozens of abandoned buildings over the years, from old factories to forgotten hospitals. Most of them are exactly what you would expect, empty shells filled with debris and graffiti. But one place I explored in rural Idaho 3 years ago was different. What I found there changed my understanding of what fear truly means, and I'm not entirely certain I escaped that place unchanged. The location was a former research facility about 40 miles outside of Boya, deep in the high desert. I had heard about it through online forums, where urban explorers share information about interesting locations. According to the limited information available, the facility had been operated by a private contractor, doing work for the government back in the 1960s and 1970s. The project had been shut down abruptly in 1978, and the buildings had been left to decay ever since. No one seemed to know exactly what kind of research had been conducted there, which only made it more intriguing to me. I drove out on a Saturday morning in early March. The weather was cold and overcast, with a biting wind that swept across the open landscape. The facility was located at the end of a badly deteriorated access road that wound through sagebrush and rocky terrain. As I approached, I could see several buildings clustered together, all constructed from gray concrete and steel. The windows were either broken or boarded over, and the entire complex was surrounded by a rusted chain link fence topped with sagging barbed wire. I parked my truck and grabbed my backpack, which contained my camera, flashlights, spare batteries, and basic safety equipment. Getting past the fence was not difficult. Decades of neglect had left multiple gaps and openings. I squeezed through and approached the main building, a 3-story rectangular structure that dominated the site. The front entrance was locked, but not secure. The door had been forced open previously, probably by other explorers, and hung slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside, my flashlight beam cutting through the dim interior. The air inside was stale and cold, with that distinctive smell of mildew and decay that pervades all abandoned buildings. The ground floor consisted mainly of offices and administrative spaces. Desks and filing cabinets remained, most empty, but some still containing yellowed papers and faded documents. I photographed everything, documenting the layout and any interesting details. The paperwork I found was mostly mundane, requisition forms and equipment inventories, nothing that revealed what the facility had actually been used for. I spent about an hour on the ground floor before locating the stairs to the basement level. The stairwell was dark and narrow, descending into complete blackness. I made my way down carefully, testing each step before putting my full weight on it. The basement was significantly colder than the upper floors, and my breath formed visible clouds in the beam of my flashlight. The basement level was laid out differently than the floors above. Instead of open office spaces, there was a long central corridor with heavy metal doors on either side, each marked with numbers, but no other identifying information. I tried several doors and found them locked or rusted shut. But about halfway down the corridor, I found one that opened with some effort. The room beyond was small, maybe 10 feet x 12 feet, with concrete walls and a bare concrete floor. It was completely empty except for a single piece of furniture, a metal chair bolted to the floor in the center of the room. On the wall behind the chair were the remnants of what looked like soundproofing material, mostly rotted away, but still clinging in patches to the concrete. I photographed the room and continued down the corridor. Most of the other accessible rooms were similar small concrete cells with minimal furnishings and sign of soundproofing. Whatever had happened here, it had involved isolation and controlled environments. The thought made me uneasy, but I pressed on. At the end of the corridor was a larger door, also metal, but this one was unlocked and slightly open. I pushed it wide and found myself in what appeared to be a storage and archive room. Metal shelving units lined the walls, most empty, but a few still holding boxes and equipment. In the corner of the room was an old wooden desk with several drawers, and on top of the desk was something that immediately caught my attention. It was a reel-to-reel tape recorder, an old model from the 1960s or early 1970s. Beside it were stacked several small boxes, each labeled with dates and reference numbers written in faded ink. I approached the desk and examined the recorder. It was dusty but appeared to be intact. On impulse, I checked the power outlet on the wall behind the desk. To my surprise, when I flipped the breaker switch, I had noticed in the hallway a small red light on the recorder illuminated. The building still had power, at least to this section of the basement. I selected one of the tape boxes at random. The label read March 14, 1973. Subject 7, Session 12. Inside was a reel of magnetic tape, brown with age, but seemingly intact. My curiosity overwhelmed my caution. I threaded the tape onto the recorder, following the diagram on the machine, and pressed play. For a moment, there was only the hiss and crackle of old tape. Then a voice emerged, male, clinical, and detached. This is Dr. Edmund Carver. March 14, 1973. Beginning Session 12 with Subject 7. Subject has been in isolation for 48 hours with continuous auditory stimulus as detailed in previous session notes. There was a pause, then another voice, younger and strained. Please, I need water. I need to sleep. Please just let me sleep. The first voice, Dr. Carver, responded without emotion. Subject is demonstrating expected symptoms of sleep deprivation and sensory stress. We will now introduce the secondary stimulus. Begin playback. What followed made my blood run cold. Through the speakers came a sound low and rhythmic, almost like breathing but not quite human. It pulsed and echoed with an unnatural quality that immediately made me uncomfortable. Underneath the breathing sound was something else, faint whispers that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, though they were clearly part of the recording. The younger voice on the tape became agitated. No, not again, please. I hear them. I hear them all the time now. They will not stop talking. Dr. Carver's voice remained clinical. Describe what you hear, please. Detail is important for our research. They are telling me things. They know things about me. They know about my mother, about what I did when I was 12. How do they know? How can they know? The voice was rising toward panic. These are auditory hallucinations, manifestations of psychological stress. They are not real. But there was something in Dr. Carver's tone that suggested he was not entirely convinced of his own words. The tape continued for another 10 minutes, documenting the subject's growing distress as the sound continued. By the end, the younger voice was sobbing and begging while Dr. Carver continued to make notes in his detached, scientific manner. Then the tape ended with a sharp click. I sat in the silence of the basement, my hands trembling. What I had just heard was clearly documentation of psychological torture disguised as research. The casual cruelty of it, the clinical detachment, was deeply disturbing, but there was something else that bothered me even more. The sound they had played for the subject, the breathing and those whispers had affected me as well, even through the poor quality of the old recording. There was something about it that created a sense of profound unease. I should have stopped there. I should have taken the tapes and left, reported what I had found to authorities, but something compelled me to listen to more. I loaded another tape. This one dated several months later. The pattern was similar. Dr. Carver documenting sessions, subjects being exposed to various forms of sensory deprivation and psychological stress, always with that same disturbing sound as part of the experiment. As I listened to the third tape, I began to notice something strange. I was developing a headache, a dull pressure behind my eyes that grew steadily worse. My mouth felt dry, and I realized I was having trouble focusing my vision. The basement felt colder than before, and I could not seem to stop shivering. The tape I was listening to was from late 1975. The subject, a woman this time, was describing her experiences after 3 days of isolation and exposure to the auditory stimulus. I see them now, not just hear them, she said, her voice flat and emotionless. They stand in the corners. They watch me. They are tall and thin. And they do not have faces. Not really, just suggestions of faces. And they keep telling me to do things, terrible things. Dr. Carver's response was different this time. He sounded uncertain, even troubled. The visual hallucinations are unexpected. This was not observed in previous subjects. Describe their appearance in more detail. But I did not hear the woman's response, because at that moment I saw movement in my peripheral vision. I turned my head sharply and saw nothing, just the empty basement room and the shadows cast by my flashlight. But I could have sworn something had been there, something tall standing just at the edge of the light. My headache intensified, and I realized with growing alarm that I was experiencing the same symptoms described on the tapes. Headache, dry mouth, visual disturbances, difficulty focusing, and underneath it all, a growing sense that I was not alone in this basement, that something was watching me from the darkness. I forced myself to shut off the tape recorder and step away from the desk, but the feelings did not stop. If anything, they intensified. The whispers I had heard on the recording seemed to echo in my mind, not as external sounds, but as intrusive thoughts that felt alien and wrong. And in the corner of the room, just beyond where my flashlight could reach, I sensed something waiting. I grabbed my backpack and left that room, moving quickly down the corridor toward the stairs. Behind me, I heard a sound, faint but distinct footsteps, slow and deliberate, following me through the basement. I did not look back. I climbed the stairs as fast as I could and ran through the ground floor, bursting out of the building into the cold afternoon air. The sunlight and open space provided immediate relief, but the effects did not completely fade. For hours after leaving the facility, I continued to experience the headache and the sense of being watched. That night in my hotel room, I woke repeatedly from nightmares filled with that pulsing, breathing sound and visions of tall, thin figures standing silently in dark corners. Over the following weeks, the symptoms gradually diminished, but never completely disappeared. I still experience occasional headaches and moments where I see movement in my peripheral vision, only to turn and find nothing there. I researched the facility extensively and found very limited information. It had been operated by a now-defunct private company under contract with a government agency whose records are still classified. The project was shut down in 1978 following what was vaguely described as an incident, but no details are available. I have thought a lot about what Dr. Carver and his colleagues were trying to achieve in that facility. They were clearly experimenting with psychological manipulation and sensory control, but the recordings suggested something more. They seemed to be trying to induce specific types of hallucinations and psychological states through carefully engineered auditory stimuli. And based on the later tapes and my own experience, they succeeded in ways they may not have intended or fully understood. Whatever that sound was, whatever frequency or pattern they had discovered, it had real psychological effects that persisted beyond exposure, and the subjects' descriptions of the things they saw, tall, thin figures without faces, matched too closely with my own experiences to be coincidence. I have not returned to that facility, and I never reported what I found. Who would believe me? And what would I even report that I listened to old recordings and developed psychosomatic symptoms? But I know what I experienced was real, and I know that whatever research was being conducted in that basement had opened doors that should have remained closed. Some knowledge is dangerous not because of what it reveals, but because the very act of knowing changes you in ways that cannot be undone. My name is Grace, and I have always been drawn to forgotten places and lost history. Growing up in Colorado, I spent countless hours reading about the state's mining boom and the dozens of ghost towns that dot the mountains, remnants of a time when fortune seekers flooded these hills, searching for gold and silver. Most of these towns are well-documented tourist attractions or historical sites. But there are others, places that exist only in rumor and whispered stories, towns that were deliberately erased from maps and memory for reasons that no one will openly discuss. 3 years ago, I found one of these places, and what I discovered there has haunted me ever since. The story began with my grandfather, who passed away when I was 26. While helping my mother clean out his house, I found a collection of old journals and papers he had kept in a locked desk drawer. My grandfather had been a geology professor and an amateur historian with a particular interest in Colorado's mining history. Among his papers was a leather-bound notebook filled with handwritten notes and sketches. As I flipped through the pages, one entry caught my attention. It was dated 1989 and described a research trip my grandfather had taken into the San Juan Mountains. He wrote about local legends concerning a mining town called Redemption that had existed somewhere in a remote valley northwest of Silverton. According to the stories he had collected, Redemption had been established in 1882 and had grown rapidly to a population of nearly 800 people. But in the winter of 1891, an outbreak of disease swept through the town. Within weeks, more than half the population had died. What happened next, according to the legends, was unprecedented. The territorial authorities, fearing the disease would spread to other settlements, made the decision to quarantine Redemption completely. They sent in armed men who sealed every road leading out of the valley and established a perimeter that no one was allowed to cross. The remaining townspeople were left to die or survive on their own. By spring of 1892, when officials finally entered the valley, they found no survivors. Every building in Redemption was empty, the streets deserted. But instead of burning the town or leaving it as a memorial, the authorities did something stranger. According to my grandfather's notes, they systematically buried the entire town. They collapsed buildings into their basements and foundations, then covered everything with earth and rock hauled from the surrounding hills. Within months, Redemption had vanished, hidden beneath tons of soil and vegetation. The official records were sealed or destroyed, and the town was removed from maps. Within a generation, most people had forgotten it had ever existed. My grandfather had been fascinated by this story and had spent years trying to locate the site of redemption. His notes included topographical maps with various locations marked and crossed out, coordinates of areas he had searched and interviewed with elderly residents who remembered hearing stories about the buried town from their own grandparents, but he had never found it. His final entry, dated 1995, expressed frustration and resignation. He had concluded that either the town had never existed or the location had been so thoroughly obscured that finding it was impossible. Reading through these notes reignited something in me. I had my grandfather's passion for historical mysteries, and I had resources he had not possessed: modern satellite imagery, GPS technology, and online databases of historical records. I spent months researching, cross-referencing his notes with current geological surveys and historical documents I dug up from various archives, and slowly I began to narrow down the possible locations. The breakthrough came when I found a reference in an 1890 territorial survey document that mentioned a valley called Bitter Creek Basin. The name matched one that appeared multiple times in my grandfather's notes. When I located Bitter Creek Basin on modern topographical maps, I noticed something interesting. The valley floor showed unusual elevation variations and patterns that did not match the surrounding natural terrain. It looked like something had been artificially altered and then left to erode naturally over more than a century. In early September, I packed my gear and drove to Silverton. From there, I hired a local guide with an off-road vehicle to take me far into the mountains as deteriorating mining roads would allow. The last several miles to Bitter Creek Basin I would have to cover on foot. I told the guide I was researching historical mining operations and would need him to pick me up at a designated spot in 3 days. He seemed skeptical about my plans, but took my money and agreed to return. The hike to Bitter Creek Basin took most of a day. The trail was barely visible in places, overgrown and washed out by decades of weather. As I climbed higher into the mountains, the forest grew thicker and the air colder. By late afternoon, I emerged from the tree inn and found myself looking down into a long, narrow valley surrounded by steep mountain walls. This was Bitter Creek Basin. The valley floor was covered with grass, wildflowers, and scattered stands of aspen trees. At first glance, it looked completely natural and undisturbed, but as I made my way down into the basin and began walking across it, I started noticing irregularities. The ground beneath my feet felt wrong, too firm in some places, and oddly hollow in others. There were depressions in the earth at regular intervals, barely visible beneath the vegetation, but definitely present once I started looking for them. I pulled out the metal detector I had brought and began sweeping it across the ground. Almost immediately, it began registering strong signals. I marked several spots with stakes and began digging at one of them with a collapsible shovel. About 2 feet down, my shovel hit something solid. I cleared away more dirt and exposed weathered wood, old planks that had once been part of a structure. Over the next several hours, I dug at multiple locations across the valley floor. Everywhere I tried, I found the same thing buried beneath 1 to 3 feet of soil, where the remains of buildings collapsed and compressed, but still identifiable. I uncovered sections of walls, fragments of furniture, rusted metal tools, and broken glass. This was not a natural site. This was redemption, exactly as my grandfather's notes had described. An entire town deliberately buried and left to be forgotten. As the sun began setting behind the mountain peaks, I set up my tent near the center of the valley and prepared to spend the night. I was excited by what I had found, but also deeply unsettled. There was something oppressive about this place, a heaviness in the air that I could not quite explain. As darkness fell, the feeling intensified. I sat outside my tent, heating a meal on my camp stove and watching the stars emerge overhead. The night was absolutely silent. No wind, no animal sounds, no insects, just complete oppressive silence. I had camped alone in remote locations many times before and had never experienced anything like this. It felt wrong, as if the valley itself was holding its breath. Around midnight, I was awakened by a sound. At first, I could not identify it. A faint creaking noise like old wood under strain. I lay in my sleeping bag listening. The sound came again, louder this time, and I realized it was coming from beneath me. The ground under my tent was creaking, as if something below was shifting or settling. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. Outside, the valley was bathed in pale moonlight, and what I saw made my blood run cold. All across the valley floor, the depressions I had noticed earlier were more pronounced now, deeper, as if the ground was slowly collapsing inward. And from these depressions, a faint mist was rising. thin tendrils of fog that seemed to glow slightly in the moonlight. As I watched, the creaking sounds intensified and multiplied. It was coming from all around me, from every direction across the valley. The buried town was shifting, settling as if responding to my presence. The mist grew thicker, rising higher from the collapsing depressions, and then I saw shapes in the mist. They were vague at first, just darker patches within the fog. But as they drew closer, they began to take on more defined forms. Human figures, dozens of them, emerging from the mist and walking slowly across the valley floor. They moved with an odd shuffling gait, their forms flickering and indistinct. Some appeared to be wearing old-fashioned clothing, long dresses, and work-see clothes from the 1890s. Others were harder to make out, their shapes distorted and wrong. I stood frozen outside my tent, unable to move or look away. The figures were converging on my location, approaching from all sides in complete silence. As they got closer, I could see that their faces were visible but horribly wrong. Sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, skin pulled tight over bone. They looked like people who had died of disease and starvation preserved somehow in the moment of their death. The closest figure stopped about 20 feet from me. It was a woman, or had been once. She wore a long dark dress covered in dirt, and her hair hung in limp strands around her gaunt face. She stared at me with empty eyes, her mouth working as if trying to speak, but producing no sound. Then she raised one skeletal hand and pointed at the ground beneath my feet. I looked down and felt my stomach drop. The ground directly under me was subsiding, caving inward. I could feel it giving way beneath my boots. I stumbled backward away from the depression and watched as it collapsed further, revealing darkness below, old timbers, fragments of walls, and something else. Bones, human bones, dozens of them, tangled together in the remains of what must have been a mass grave. The realization hit me with terrible clarity. The authorities had not just buried the town, they had buried the people. Everyone who had died in the outbreak, and possibly those who had still been alive when they sealed the valley. Redemption was not just a ghost town. It was a tomb, a mass grave disguised as a disappeared settlement. The figures in the mist were closer now, surrounding me on all sides. Their faces were clearer, and I could see the accusation in their hollow eyes, the anger and despair. They had been left to die, and then erased from history, buried alive or dead in this forgotten valley. And now I had disturbed their rest. I did not wait to see what they would do. I grabbed my backpack from the tent, abandoning everything else, and ran. I ran toward the edge of the valley, away from the figures, and the collapsing ground, and the bones, emerging from the earth. Behind me, I heard sounds, not footsteps exactly, but a rustling, dragging noise as the mist figures followed. I reached the tree and plunged into the forest, branches whipping at my face as I crashed through the undergrowth. I did not look back. I just kept running, guided only by my flashlight and pure terror until exhaustion finally forced me to stop. I collapsed against a tree trunk, gasping for breath, and listened. The forest around me was normal now. I could hear wind in the trees, small animals moving through the underbrush, the natural sounds of night. Whatever had been in that valley had not followed me beyond its boundaries. I spent the rest of the night huddled under a boulder, too frightened to sleep. At first light, I started hiking toward the Rendezvous Point where my guide was supposed to meet me in 2 days. I walked continuously, stopping only briefly to rest, and reached the meeting spot a full day early. I waited there until the guide arrived, then left the mountains without explanation. I have not returned to Bitter Creek Basin, and I destroyed my notes and research about its location. Some places are buried and forgotten for good reason. The people of Redemption died horribly, abandoned, and then erased from history. What I saw in that valley was their collective trauma, their anger and pain made manifest. They do not want to be found or remembered. They want to be left alone in their mass grave disguised as a disappeared town. My grandfather spent years searching for redemption and never found it. Perhaps that was a mercy. Some historical mysteries are better left unsolved. Some forgotten places better left buried. I learned that lesson in a valley full of ghosts and collapsing ground. And it is a lesson I will carry for the rest of my life. My name is Leo, and I have been driving cross-country for work for the better part of 15 years. I have seen almost every corner of this nation, from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific, from the Canadian border to the Gulf of Mexico. In all those miles and all those years, I have learned that the American landscape is full of strange places, forgotten corners, where time seems to move differently or not at all. But nothing I've encountered in my travels compares to what happened on a lonely stretch of Kansas Highway 5 years ago. What I experienced that night defies rational explanation, and the physical evidence I brought back with me proves that it was not a dream or hallucination. It was late October, and I was driving from Denver to Kansas City on a tight deadline. I had left Colorado in the early afternoon, planning to drive straight through the night to make my morning meeting. The route took me across the eastern plains of Colorado and into western Kansas through some of the most desolate and empty country America. Mile after mile of flat grassland, the occasional farmhouse or grain elevator breaking the monotony, and long stretches where the only signs of civilization were the fence posts running alongside the highway. By the time the sun set, I had crossed into Kansas. The traffic was almost non-existent, maybe 1 or 2 cars passing in the opposite direction every 10 or 15 minutes. I had the radio on for company, scanning through stations as they faded in and out of the range. Around 9 at night, I noticed my fuel gauge was getting low. I had been so focused on making time that I had not stopped for gas since leaving Denver. I checked my GPS for the nearest gas station. The device showed one coming up in about 15 miles, right off the highway, at mile marker 39. I had driven this route before and could not recall a gas station at that location, but GPS systems are constantly updated with new information. Perhaps a new truck stop had opened since my last trip through this area. As I approached mile marker 39, I saw lights ahead, a warm yellow glow that stood out against the darkness of the surrounding plains. Sure enough, there was an exit, and at the end of the short off-ramp sat a gas station. It was an old-fashioned setup, the kind you do not see much anymore. A single building with large windows, 2 fuel pumps out front with the old-style analog display, and a red and white sign that read Highway Service Station in weathered letters. I pulled off the highway and up to one of the pumps. The station looked well-maintained, despite its vintage appearance, clean and brightly lit. Through the windows, I could see shelves stocked with merchandise and what appeared to be a small diner area with a counter and stools. A figure moved inside, someone working behind the counter. I got out of my car and approached the pump. It was an old model. Nothing digital about it, just mechanical dials and a simple lever-style handle. There was no card reader, no modern payment system. A handwritten sign taped to the pump read, "Please pay inside." The air outside was cold and still with no wind at all. I noticed that despite being right next to a highway, I could not hear any traffic. The silence was complete and slightly unsettling. I walked to the door and pushed it open, triggering a small bell that chimed as I entered. The interior of the station was like stepping into another era. The floor was black and white, checkered tile polished to a shine. The shelves were stocked with products, but as I looked closer, I noticed the packaging looked dated, not old or worn, but designed in styles from decades past. Glass bottles of soda with metal caps, candy bars and wrappers I had only seen in old photographs. Magazines on a rack with cover dates I could not quite make out. Behind the counter stood a man in his 50s or 60s, wearing a clean pressed shirt and a paper cap. He smiled pleasantly as I approached. "Evening," he said. "What can I do for you?" "I need to fill up," I replied. "How much is gas?" 29 cents a gallon, he said without hesitation. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline. When none came, I forced a laugh. "That is some kind of promotional price, right? Throwback Thursday or something." He looked at me with genuine confusion. "No, sir. That is just the price. You want regular or premium." Something was very wrong here, but I could not quite identify what. The price he quoted was impossibly low, something from 50 or 60 years in the past, but he had said it with such casual normality that it threw me off balance. "Regular is fine," I said slowly. "I will fill the tank. You can pump it yourself," he said. "Come back in when you are done, and we will settle up." I walked back outside in a daze. The station, the prices, the entire atmosphere felt wrong, dislocated from time. I filled my tank, watching the mechanical dials on the pump spin slowly as the fuel flowed. When the tank was full, the pump clicked off, and the display showed 14 gallons at 29 each. The total was $46. I went back inside. The attendant was still behind the counter now, wiping down the surface with a rag. $406, he said cheerfully. I pulled out my wallet and handed him a $5 bill. He opened an old-style cash register with a mechanical ring and handed me back 94 cents and change. The coins felt cold and heavy in my hand. "Long way from home?" he asked as he counted out the change. "Denver," I said, "heading to Kansas City." He nodded knowingly. "A lot of folks pass through here, heading east. You be careful out there. Roads can be tricky at night." "How long has this station been here?" I asked, unable to stop myself from trying to understand what I was experiencing. "Oh, since 1952, he said proudly. "Family business. My daddy built this place, and I have been running it since he passed. We take care of folks traveling through, make sure they have what they need for the road." 1952. The year kept echoing in my mind. "What year is it?" I asked, the question sounding absurd even as I spoke it. He gave me another confused look. 1952, course. You feeling all right, mister? You look a little pee. My heart was pounding now. This was not right. None of this was right. I looked around the station again. Really looked. Everything was consistent with the early 1950s. The products, the fixtures, the style of everything. But it was all too perfect, too preserved. There was no wear, no accumulated age. It was like a museum diorama come to life. I need to go, I said abruptly. I turned and headed for the door. Hold on, the attendant called after me. You forgot your receipt. He held out a small slip of paper. Against my better judgment, I took it. The paper was thin and slightly yellowed with purple ink from what looked like a carbon copy. It listed the date as October 18th, 1952, the gallons pumped, and the total amount. At the bottom was a stamp, Highway Service Station, Mile 39, Kansas. I shoved the receipt in my pocket and pushed through the door. As I walked quickly to my car, I looked around the station lot. There were 2 other vehicles parked near the building, but they were not modern cars. One was a late 1940s Ford pickup truck, the other a early 1952 sedan, both in pristine condition. I had not noticed them when I arrived. I got in my car, started the engine, and backed away from the pump. As I turned toward the exit, I glanced back at the station through my rear-view mirror. The attendant was standing in the doorway, watching me leave with that same pleasant smile. He raised a hand in farewell. I drove back onto the highway, my mind racing. As soon as I merged onto the road, the sounds of modern traffic returned. Cars passing at highway speeds, the normal ambient noise of travel. I looked at my dashboard clock. It showed 9:43. I had been at the station for maybe 15 minutes. I drove for another hour before I could not stand the uncertainty any longer. I pulled over at a rest stop and pulled out the receipt from my pocket. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the rest area, I examined it carefully. The paper was definitely old, not freshly printed, but genuinely aged. The ink had that faded quality of documents from decades past, and the date was clear. October 18th, 1952, but that was impossible. It was 2019. I checked my phone, which confirmed the current date. I checked my fuel gauge. The tank was full exactly as it should be after I had just filled up. I had physical evidence that I had been somewhere and purchased fuel, but that somewhere seemed to exist in the wrong time. When I reached Kansas City the next morning, I immediately began researching. I searched for records of the highway service station at mile marker 309 in Kansas. I found nothing in current business listings or maps, but when I dug into historical archives, I found something that made my blood run cold. There had been a service station at that location built in 1952 by a man named Harold Jennings. It had operated for several years as a family business, but in October of 1958, Harold Jennings and his station had simply vanished. One morning, a state trooper had found the station completely abandoned, a light still on, but no one present. Jennings was never seen again, and the mystery of his disappearance was never solved. The station building was eventually torn down in the early 1960s. I found one old newspaper photograph of the station from 1953. The image quality was poor, but I could make out the building, the pumps, and the sign. It matched exactly what I had seen. Standing in front of the station in the photo, smiling at the camera, was Harold Jennings. He looked exactly like the attendant who has served me. Over the following months, I tried several times to find that exit and that station again. I drove the same route at the same time of night, looking for mile marker 39 and the lights of the highway service station. I never found it. The area where it should be is just empty. Grassland now, no exit ramp, no lights, nothing. Just darkness and the endless Kansas plains. But I still have the receipt. I have kept it in a protective sleeve, and I have shown it to several people, including a document expert, who confirmed that the paper and ink are consistent with materials used in the early 1950s. The receipt is real as the 14 gallons of gasoline I pumped into my car that night. I have read about similar experiences reported by other drivers, stories of travelers who encounter places that should not exist or that exist in the wrong time. Phantom gas stations, diners where the customers are decades out of date, hotels where you check in but can never find again. Most people dismiss these stories as urban legends or the result of exhaustion and highway hypnosis. But I know differently now. There are thin places in this country, spots where the boundary between past and present becomes permeable. Places where something from another time can break through into our reality or where we can slip backward into a moment that is still somehow happening, preserved, and repeating like a recording. I found one of these places on a Kansas highway at mile marker 39. And for 15 minutes, I existed in 2 times at once. Sometimes late at night, when I'm driving through empty country, I find myself looking for those warm yellow lights, that red and white sign, hoping and dreading in equal measure that I might see them again. Because as unsettling as the experience was, there was something compelling about it too. A chance to step outside of time, to visit a moment preserved perfectly like an insect in amber. Harold Jennings is still there, I think, still running his station, still serving travelers who passed through his particular slice of eternity. He does not know he is a ghost and operating a ghost station in a year that ended more than 60 years ago. Or perhaps he knows and does not care, content to fulfill his purpose forever in that endless October night in 1952. I keep the receipt in my glove compartment now, right next to my current registration and insurance papers, a reminder that the world is stranger and more layered than we usually acknowledge, and that sometimes when we travel through the empty places, we travel through more than just geography. We travel through time itself, and occasionally, if conditions are right, we can find ourselves somewhere, and somewhere we were never supposed to be. My name is Chloe, and I have lived in Oregon my entire life. I grew up in Portland, but have always loved the mountains and the wild back country that defines so much of this state. I have driven every major highway and explored countless logging roads and mountain passes. I thought I knew these roads well, thought I understood the dangers they presented. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on a remote stretch of Highway 224 in the Cascade foothills 6 years ago. What started as a routine drive home turned into something that still gives me nightmares, has fundamentally changed how I understand the darkness that can exist in isolated places. It was late March, and I had spent the weekend visiting a friend who lived in a small town near Mount Hood. I left her place around 11 at night, later than I had intended, but not concerned. I had made this drive dozens of times before. Highway 224 is a winding mountain road that follows the Clackamas River through dense forest. During the day, it is beautiful. At night, it is dark and empty with long stretches where you might not see another car for 30 minutes or more. The weather was clear but cold, with temperatures hovering just above freezing. My headlights cut through the darkness as I navigated the curves following the yellow center line. I had driven for about 40 minutes and was maybe 20 meters from where the highway would intersect with a larger road when I saw her. At first, she was just a figure at the edge of my headlight beam, standing in the middle of my lane. I slammed on my brakes, the car skidding slightly before coming to a stop about 15 feet from where she stood. My heart was pounding, adrenaline flooding my system. I had come so close to hitting her. She was young, maybe 16 or 17 years old, wearing only a thin white t-shirt and jeans despite the cold. No jacket, no shoes. Her feet were bare and filthy, stained with dirt, and what looked like dried blood. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around her face, and her arms were wrapped around herself as if trying to stay warm. But what struck me most were her eyes. Even from inside my car, I could see the terror in them, the kind of fear that goes beyond words. She did not move as I sat there trying to process what I was seeing. She just stood there in my headlights, shaking, her eyes locked on something behind her in the darkness of the forest. I rolled down my window. "Are you okay?" I called out, knowing it was a stupid question. She was clearly not okay. She turned to look at me then, and I saw her face more clearly. She was covered in scratches and bruises, her arms marked with cuts and scars that looked both fresh and old. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and her entire body was trembling violently. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, she raised one skeletal arm and pointed frantically toward the trees on the north side of the road. I looked where she was pointing, but saw only darkness and the dense wall of Douglas firs that lined the highway. When I looked back at her, she was shaking her head desperately and pointing more insistently at the trees. Her mouth was moving, forming words I could not hear. But the message was clear. There was something in those woods, something she was terrified of. I made a decision. I unlocked the passenger door and leaned over to push it open. "Get in," I said. "Get in the car right now." She did not hesitate. She stumbled forward and climbed into the passenger seat, her movement weak and uncoordinated. Up close, she looked even worse. The scratches on her arms were deep, some infected. Her wrists bore marks that looked like restraint injuries, raw circles of damaged skin. And her neck had bruising in the pattern of fingers, as if someone had tried to strangle her. I grabbed a blanket from the back seat and wrapped it around her shoulders. She pulled it tight and curled into herself, still shaking. "We need to get you to a hospital," I said, already reaching for my phone. But when I checked, there was no signal. We were in a dead zone common in these mountains. "What is your name?" I asked gently. She did not respond, just stared straight ahead through the windshield at the dark forest. Can you tell me what happened? Her mouth moved again, and this time a sound came out, barely a whisper. They are still there. Who is still there? I pressed. In the woods. Her voice was hoarse and broken. He has others in the compound. They are still there. A chill ran down my spine. How many others? She held up her hand, fingers spread. 5. Then she made a fist and opened her hand again. 5 more. 10 total, if I was understanding correctly. 10 other people, wherever she had come from. I put the car in gear and started driving, heading toward civilization as fast as I dared. On the winding road, I kept checking my phone, waiting for a signal so I could call for help. The girl sat silently beside me, occasionally glancing in the side mirror, as if checking to see if we were being followed. After about 10 minutes, I finally got one bar of service. I immediately called 911. The dispatcher answered, and I explained the situation as clearly as I could. I'd found a young woman on Highway 224. She appeared to have been held captive and possibly tortured. She claimed there were others still being held somewhere in the forest near mile marker 47. The dispatcher stayed on the line, asking questions and trying to get more information from the girl, but she would not or could not speak to the phone. She just kept staring out the window and occasionally pointing at the forest we were leaving behind. It took another 30 minutes to reach the small town where the nearest sheriff's station was located. By the time we arrived, 2 deputies were already waiting outside. They approached carefully as I pulled into the lot, their hands near their weapons. The girl tensed when she saw them, but I spoke softly to her, telling her they were there to help. The deputies separated us immediately. They took the girl inside, while another deputy stayed with me, taking my statement. I told him everything from the moment I saw her in the road to what she had said about others being held in the woods. He wrote it all down, his expression growing more serious with each detail. Over the next several hours, I gave multiple statements to different law enforcement officers. State police arrived, then FBI agents. The girl, whose name I learned was Sarah, was taken to a hospital and then into protective custody. I was not allowed to see her again that night, but I learned bits and pieces of what was happening from the officers who questioned me. Sarah had been missing for 14 months. She had disappeared while hiking alone on a trail not far from where I found her. Her family had searched desperately, organized volunteer efforts, offered rewards, but there had been no trace of her, no clues. She had simply vanished into the forest. Based on the information Sarah provided, law enforcement organized a massive search operation using search and rescue teams, helicopters with thermal imaging, and trained K-9 units. They began scouring the forest in the area she had indicated. It took 2 days, but they found it, hidden deep in a remote valley. Accessible only by an overgrown logging road that did not appear on any map, was a compound, multiple structures built from salvaged materials and hidden beneath the forest canopy. The place had been there for years, maybe decades, completely undetected, despite being only a few miles from a major highway. Inside they found evidence of long-term captivity, chains, locks, makeshift cells, and they found 9 people, 8 women and 1 man, ranging in age from 15 to 32. All had been reported missing at various times over the past 7 years. All had been taken from trails or remote areas in the Cascade Mountains. And all had been held captive by a man who lived alone in those woods, surviving off the grid and taking victims whenever opportunity presented itself. The man himself was found dead in the main structure, an apparent suicide when he realized authorities were closing in, but the evidence they collected painted a horrific picture of systematic kidnapping and abuse spanning at least a decade. Sarah had been the newest captive until 3 months earlier, when another woman had been brought to the compound. That new arrival had created an opportunity. In the confusion of dealing with 2 difficult captives, Sarah had managed to escape, fleeing into the forest, and eventually making it to the highway where I found her. The media coverage was intense. The case became national news. The story of the hidden compound and the survivors who had endured years of captivity in the Oregon wilderness. I was interviewed multiple times, always identified only as the driver who found Sarah and called for help. I declined to appear on camera or reveal my full name. What I had done was simply what anyone should do when they encounter someone in desperate need of help. Over the following months, I learned more about the survivors and their recoveries. Sarah was the youngest and had been captive the shortest time. She recovered physically relatively quickly, though the psychological trauma would take years to process. Others had been held for 5, 6, even 7 years. The oldest captive, a woman named Patricia, who had been missing since 2008, had almost no memory of her life before being taken. She had been 23 when she vanished on a solo camping trip and was now 30 when she was finally freed. The compound was thoroughly documented and then burned by authorities. The logging road was blocked, and the area designated as off-limits. But I know it is still there in the forest. The traces of that horror, the scars on the land where such darkness existed for so long, completely hidden from the world. I still drive Highway 224, though not as often and never alone at night. Every time I pass mile marker 47, I think about Sarah standing barefoot in the middle of the road, pointing at the forest, and trying to warn me about the evil that lurked in those trees. I think about the 9 others who were rescued because she had the courage to escape, and because I happened to drive by at exactly the right moment. The case has stayed with me in ways I did not expect. I have nightmares sometimes about what would have happened if I had been 30 seconds earlier or later, if I had not seen Sarah in time, if I had decided not to stop. I think about all the other remote places in these mountains, all the valleys and hidden corners that no one ever visits, and I wonder how many other compounds might exist, how many other people might be suffering in isolation while the rest of us drive past on well-traveled roads completely unaware of the darkness that exists just beyond the tree. Sarah contacted me once. About a year after that night, she sent a letter through the victim services coordinator thanking me for stopping and for getting help. She told me she was doing better, working with therapists, and slowly rebuilding her life. She said she still had nightmares but was learning to manage them, and she said something that I have never forgotten. She wrote that the worst part of captivity had not been the physical abuse or the fear. It had been the certainty that no one would ever find her, that she would die in those woods without anyone knowing what had happened to her. The fact that she escaped and that others were rescued had given her a sense of purpose and meaning that helped her cope with the trauma. I keep that letter in a drawer beside my bed. On nights when my own nightmares wake me, when I see Sarah's terrified face in my mind or imagine the years of suffering endured by those captives, I read her words, and I remind myself that sometimes darkness is defeated, not by grand heroic actions, but by simple human decency. By the choice to stop when we see someone in need, to listen when they try to tell us about horrors we can scarcely imagine, and to act when action is required. That night on Highway 224, I made those choices, and because of them, 10 people were given back their lives and their freedom. It is a responsibility I will carry forever. The knowledge that a single moment in a single decision can mean the difference between life and death, between hope and despair, between rescue and oblivion. My name is Jackson, and I have been an avid outdoorsman for most of my life. I hunt, fish, and spend as much time as possible in the wilderness of Upper Michigan, where the forests are dense and the winters are brutal. 3 years ago, I borrowed a hunting cabin from a friend for a solo deer hunting trip in late November. The cabin was located deep in the Ottawa National Forest, accessible only by a rough 2-track road that was barely passable, even with 4-wheel drive. It was the kind of place where you could go days without seeing another human being, which was exactly what I wanted. But what I experienced during my 3 nights in that cabin has made me question everything I thought I knew about isolation and the things that can exist in truly remote places. The cabin belonged to my friend's grandfather, who had built it in the 1960s as a hunting retreat. It was a simple structure, 1 room with a wood stove, a cot, a small table, and not much else. No electricity, no running water, just 4 walls and a roof to keep out the elements. My friend had used it occasionally over the years, but admitted that he never felt entirely comfortable there. He said the place had a strange atmosphere, though he could not explain exactly what he meant. I dismissed his concerns as superstition and headed up on a Friday afternoon in late November. The drive took longer than expected as the 2-track was in worse condition than I remembered. By the time I reached the cabin, it was already getting dark. The structure sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering white pines and birch trees. It looked weathered but solid, smoke-stained, and gray with age. I unloaded my gear, started a fire in the wood stove, and settled in for the evening. The first night was unremarkable. I ate dinner, checked my hunting equipment for the morning, and went to bed early. The cabin was cold despite the fire, and I could hear the wind moving through the trees outside. Normal sounds for a wilderness cabin. I fell asleep easily and slept through the night without incident. The next morning I was up before dawn. I spent the day hunting, covering several miles of forest without seeing much game. By the time I returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, I was exhausted and cold. I rekindled the fire, made dinner, and sat at the small table writing in my hunting journal. That was when I first heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the wood stove settling, a faint sound, rhythmic and soft, coming from somewhere inside the cabin. I stopped writing and listened. The sound continued, a slow, steady pattern that reminded me of breathing in and out with perfect regularity. I stood up and walked around the small space, trying to locate the source. The sound seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, specifically from the section of wall behind the cot. I pressed my ear against the rough wood planks and listened. The breathing sound was clearer now, definitely coming from within the wall, but that made no sense. The cabin was built with solid logs, and there was no hollow space where something could be making that noise. I checked outside, thinking maybe animal had somehow gotten into the structure, but I found nothing. The exterior walls were intact, no holes or gaps. When I went back inside, the breathing had stopped. I convinced myself I had imagined it or misidentified some other sound. I finished my journal entry and went to bed. I woke sometime in the middle of the night. The fire had died down to embers, and the cabin was dark except for a faint red glow from the stove. I lay on the cot, disoriented, trying to remember what had woken me. Then I heard it again, the breathing louder now, coming from the wall right next to my head. In and out, slow and measured. But there was something wrong with the rhythm. It was too slow, too deliberate.